Hello and welcome to The Insider, a show designed to clue you into the biggest news, events and announcements inside the video games industry, discussing with you some things you may know, some things you may not, and the glue that holds it all together is a little bit of my own opinion. My name is Paul James, thank you very much for watching, and let's get for the episode.
You stick with me and I'll teach you a few things.
No offense, but I don't even know you.
My friends call me Sully.
Nathan Drake.
So the state of single-player games has been a discussion for quite a few years now. There's been lots of people suggesting that the era of the golden age of the single-player game is over, and there's others proclaiming that it's still alive and kicking and doing fine. Well, there's been some comments made by Amy Hennig, a very famous developer responsible for Uncharted. She was at one point there working on the cancelled Star Wars game, Legacy of Kain, and several other fantastic games over the journey. She's lent her own voice to the argument. She's made some comments that have aggravated some on both sides of the fence. Many have shouted her down, but is she onto something? We're going to talk about that in this week's episode of The Insider.
You know that you're my superstar. No one else can take me this far. I'm flipping the switch. Get ready for this song. Let's do the Odyssey.
So the comment that seems to have inflamed so many people basically relates to the Uncharted franchise, a franchise near and dear to my heart. Amy Hennig said, and again as the creator of Uncharted, that an Uncharted game, Uncharted 1, it wouldn't have been approved if that game was pitched today versus what it was ahead of its release in 2007. It's because the game was finite. It's a linear game. It was an 8 to 9 hour experience, and there were no extra modes. There was no online, there was no multiplayer, there was no leaderboards. The only incentive to go back and replay the game was to unlock a few cheats, Donut Drake and whatnot. Those sort of perks weren't enough in the current setting to warrant a proper release. And it makes sense. If you think about the games that are being released, they're huge, sprawling, several dozen hour-long games, even if they're not an RPG. And then you've got plenty of online modes, you've got shared world experiences, all games that have a tail. So a game like an Uncharted wouldn't necessarily get the same approval now that it did over a decade ago. They were interesting comments, and they're going to spur the rest of this conversation.
Peter, it's time to get up.
Those opposed to Amy Hennig's comments were swift in their response, and they were decisive. They spoke about how God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon Zero Dawn, Mario, Zelda Breath of the Wild, Final Fantasy, Fallout, Elder Scrolls, Doom, all these massive franchises were all getting multi-million unit sales. And the ones, if we want to focus specifically on the PlayStation family, that were getting focused on the most were God of War with over 10 million sales, Spider-Man with over 10 million sales, Horizon, 10 million sales. There were some fantastic sales figures for a lot of these games. But the thing that a lot of people seem to forget when they're rattling off this particular list, as well as a few others that I haven't specified here, of games, is the fact that those are all established IP outside of Horizon. They're all established IP. Spider-Man is obviously one of the biggest franchises in the world, not just in games, but multimedia. God of War's huge. Final Fantasy's been huge. Mario and Zelda, they're staples. They're 30 years old. You can say the same for your Elder Scrolls and Dooms and Fallouts and Final Fantasies. All these franchises are massive. You're not actually comparing apples to apples here. It's a far more challenging thing to establish a new IP in this day and age that is a more linear style experience than it is to release a sequel or a reboot of an existing franchise. As, for example, we saw with God of War last year. It was huge, it was successful, it sold the lights out. But even though it was a reboot, and even though it just said God of War, there was no numbers or anything that sort of thing, it is established IP. It's a known franchise, it's got a known protagonist. We knew a lot about this thing, there's an established audience. I was one of them. It didn't matter whether the game was a 2 out of 10. People were going to buy it because of the name. And maybe they'd come to realise afterwards, potentially it was crap. It obviously wasn't. But people were going to buy it because of that name. That guarantees your sales straight out the gate and makes a huge difference versus pitching a new IP. Horizon is one of those that actually struck a chord, and I'm thrilled because in my mind it was the best game of 2017. But those sort of things don't happen often, and there's some great test cases coming up in the Outer Worlds, for example. New IP, it's not meant to be, it's not as long as a Fallout like we first thought. It's a far more linear experience, apparently. So says Obsidian. It'll be interesting to see how games like that fare in this current environment. Another thing that Amy spoke about was the development time of these projects. She was brought up in an era, the games development era, where games were being churned out in a year. She spoke about how Jak 3, for example, which was in her time at Naughty Dog, was developed and released in the space of 12 months. Uncharted was a new IP for a new system. They had some hardware things, and that took 3 years, and that was a long time. But now, if you think about the current setting, 1 to 2 years is almost absurd. There's a very small number of studios that actually do that. And even then, that's a perception thing. Lots of people think that Call of Duty coming out every year means that they're churning these games out in a year. No, if you follow the industry at all, you know that Call of Duty is, there's a rotational thing there, and the next game from Infinity Ward is actually beginning about 3 years earlier. And there's little tweaks and changes that might come along based on trends within the industry. But by and large, that game has been in development for quite some time. Tokyo RPG Factory is an exception. They're trying to churn things out in line with the old sort of model that's 12 to 18 months and then the game's out the door. But there's just not many, it's not sustainable. It's not a thing that's really feasible in this current day and age if you're expecting to be fairly ambitious in what you're doing as well. So on top of that, team sizes have changed. The scopes of the games have changed. And all of these things have a massive bearing on how long it takes to create a game, what you can do with that game, because there's so many fingers in the pie, there's so many teams that are working on separate parts of the thing and it's all coming together at the end. These projects take longer to develop, they're more costly, and of course everything boils down to that almighty dollar. So if there's not ways to monetize, then it's less appealing to a publisher. And that's why we see comments like Amy's where she's talking about how an Uncharted game in its state that it was in 2007 just wouldn't be greenlit anymore. I understand it. It's hard to hear. I don't like it. But she's right.
Hey, what are you...
Why did you come here with me? What did JD tell you?
This is a wild game of survival.
Now, for all that I've been a bit doom and gloom about single-player games in this episode, there's of course plenty of good ones out there. There's plenty of good ones coming this year. Hopefully the Outer Worlds is. We've already seen your Far Cry's and Metros and those sorts of games released this year. Obviously Far Cry has some co-op elements in it. But there's plenty of awesome single-player games that are releasing this year. Devil May Cry 5 comes out today. Go pick it up, it's apparently fantastic. There's some awesome games that have released and are still coming. It doesn't mean that single-player is dead or dying. It's just the face of a single-player game looks very different to what it did even a decade ago. We're seeing single-player focused games through the indie space. And a lot of them actually we're seeing through Annapurna, for example, as a publisher. The games that wouldn't get approved by another big AAA publisher, but Annapurna is picking those up and giving them a home and making them available to us, and people like myself who are super into those sort of experiences can go and pick them up. And then on the flip side, there is the ultra AAA and specifically the first parties, because people do want these single player games. The third parties, it's harder to justify how they're going to monetize some of these experiences and how they can be sure that they're going to sell the numbers that are necessary. But first party studios, and we can see it in what happens with Nintendo via, say, Mario and Zelda, for example, or PlayStation when it comes to God of War, Uncharted, Horizon, when it comes to Xbox, and we're talking about Halo, and obviously it has its multiplayer aspects, and Gears and those sorts of things. Not Sea of Thieves. These games do actually have a home, and they are more than welcome, and they are big marquee tentpole attractions for a console or PC, but it's a little bit harder to justify in that space. There's totally a place for those, but it's where they're coming from that's starting to look different. It's starting to focus more on those first party publishers rather than just coming from everywhere like it once did.
What do you want from me?
I see great things in our future, kid. Great things.
And so that concludes this episode of The Insider. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking, sharing and subscribing. All those buttons are down below here, and hit that notification bell. That way you're alerted to every new video the moment it goes live on the channel. That includes Patched, The Insider, Player 2 Plays, Late Game Review, Gamer School, and a whole bunch more. There's some awesome content on our channel, so please be sure to go and check it out. And if you're still into video stuff, go and visit us at twitch.tv/player2au, where there's streams going on fairly regularly these days. The team is doing some awesome stuff, so please be sure to go and check that out. Catch the website, player2.net.au, where you'll find reviews, previews, opinion pieces, news, features, the Player 2 Writers Draft, links to our podcast series, Dev Diary, and the Player 2 Pixelcast, which is now hosted by the Player 2 podcast feed, so go and check that out. Visit us on Patreon, patreon.com/player2au, kick in a few bucks. At the lower tiers you get early access to episodes, higher tiers you get monthly episode exclusives, and the ability to join us in the Player 2 podcast. You'll be helping the Player 2 dream to grow, and we'd be very thankful for that. Finally, there's Twitter. You can find me at Paul James Games, the website you'll find at Player2au. And until next time, look, we've spoken about single player a lot over the course of the last few years. It's been a big conversation, it will continue to be so, but thank you for joining me in this episode. Episode 101, we're into a new stage of this show. I don't know what I'm going to do differently with it, but I'm sure there'll be a few ideas that'll crop up from time to time. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, I'll see you next time.